everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host Kushalmehra. All right, today's podcast is titled "In Pānini We Trust." So, just to give you a brief background, this podcast is about a PhD dissertation written by my guest today, Dr. Rishi Rajpopat. He published this. If I remember, at least मुझे जितना याद है, online publish हुई थी 15 December 2022 को. The dissertation was called "In Pānini We Trust: Discovering the Algorithm for Rule Conflict Resolution in the Astādhyāyī." And unlike many people Rishi must have spoken to, I actually read his PhD dissertation. It took me a little bit of time. It took a lot of effort, but I did read it, and I reached out to Rishi. I was like, "Yeah, I want you to come on the podcast and I talk about it." So now that I have explained everything, Rishi, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Kushal. Thank you for reading the thesis.
So Rishi, this is your first time on the podcast. Just a choti si request. Tell everybody a little bit about yourself. How did you get into this entire journey of discovering Pānini? Because it's fascinating, right? मतलब पाणिनि के ऊपर लोग PhD dissertation लिख रहे हैं ये चीजें. So maybe you can tell everyone about yourself and how you got into this entire journey of writing a dissertation on this thing.
Sure. So, my name is Rishi Rajpopat. As you know, I was born and brought up in Mumbai. I went to school here. I did my undergrad studies also in Mumbai at St. Xavier's, which is in South Bombay, and I did economics there actually. So this journey towards Pānini was a somewhat unplanned one, if you will. I started off with Sanskrit in high school, actually class 8. I did Sanskrit for 3 years, 8 to 10. And then in class 11, I joined PACE in Andheri actually to prepare for the IIT JEE since I used to be good at math. And I soon realized that I did not want to be an engineer despite enjoying maths, even in class 11. So then I switched back to doing other things basically, and I did Sanskrit in class 12 as well. In class 12, I think I got the highest score in two subjects, maths and Sanskrit. So I was really confused actually at that point about where my heart really lies or what I should do. But considering the fact that it's a lot more viable to do something in mathematics in terms of employability and job prospects, I ended up doing econ at Xavier's, as I said. But during those 3 years of my undergrad, I was also studying Pānini outside of college with a guru who lived not very far from where I do. So I got very fortunate. At no charge, she taught me Pānini with great zeal, enthusiasm, and interest. And that interest was absolutely infectious. And that is what brought me to think about Pānini. Um, I've always been interested in patterns and in just really crystallizing information. This is the sort of thing I enjoy. And so when I started exploring Pāninian derivations with my teacher, I realized that lots of things did not add up, did not make sense. And there were too many sources of information that we were dealing with when we were performing these derivations, which we call prakriya in Sanskrit and Hindi. So that's how I realized that there is work to be done here. My teacher was very humble, very generous. So she would answer some of my questions, but at times she would have no answers, and she would encourage me to actually go find those answers. So that's how the journey began. Towards the end of my undergrad, I realized that I think I should devote all my energy to finding some of these answers. And I wanted to do a master's, which was how do I put it? A master's which was research intensive or research focused. So I did not want to go to a lot of taught classes, as it were, on philosophy, religion, and logic and this and that. I wanted to focus on Pānini, and that's why I chose such a course, which was at Oxford. That was a 1 year master's. After which I started my PhD at Cambridge. But I was always determined to basically work on this subject. That is precisely why I started the master's in the first place.
All right, fair enough. Now Rishi, let's get straight into, as they say, the meat of the subject. So, what exactly did you discover while you were doing your research and in your dissertation? And now I'm not going to cut you off, because I know you will have to speak now for at least 15, 20, 25 minutes nonstop. So take your time. I am not Arnab Goswami, where I'll be like, no, Mr. Rajpopat, you listen to me. I'm not going to do that with you. So I want you to सिंप्लीफाई इट, एंड दिस इज माय रिक्वेस्ट कि देखो, मेरे को भी बहुत स्ट्रगल करना पड़ा डिसर्टेशन पढ़ने के टाइम पे. एवरी टाइम यू मेंशन अ टेक्निकल थिंग, आई हैव टू गो एंड सर्च इट, I have to try and understand it. So my humble request to you is, for the just for the viewers and the listeners of the podcast, when you go, take us through this journey of explaining your work. Try to simplify it at moments wherever possible. And now I hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'll do my best to really present a very simple, non-jargony picture. Um, so, what's the goal of Pānini's grammar? I mean, there's been a huge debate about what the goal of Pānini's grammar is, but I'll tell you what I think the goal of it is. The goal is to Pānini's goal when he wrote the Astādhyāyī was to construct this machine. And what this machine essentially does is it helps you derive, in quotes, all the words of Sanskrit, the version of Sanskrit that he was familiar with, and also the older version, which is Vedic. So all the words of Sanskrit as the output of the machine, when the input is roots or bases, so nominal stems, verbal roots, that kind of thing, and the suffix. So base and suffix. Suffix we call it because it is added to the right hand side. You know, in Indo-European classical languages, it's added on the right hand side. So we call it a suffix. So base plus a suffix. Let's take an example from English, because I've realized over the course of speaking with journalists that this is very helpful. Let's take the root define, right, which is to describe the essential characteristic of something, and add the affix ation to it. Ation is also found in termination, cancellation, right, beautification, and so on and so forth. So our goal is to derive a noun clearly, but it's not just the juxtaposition of these two items. It's not defination. The correct output is definition. So as your viewers will have noticed, there are certain sound changes, Kushal, that take place, and they're mostly in this instance, it's the vowels that are changing, not the consonants as much. Okay, so it's define plus ation, definition, right? And what do you do how does Pānini think? So he says, okay, let's make one change at a time, step by step, and at each step one rule applies, changes one vowel at a time. And through this series of steps, the idea is that Pānini's machine should be able to derive the grammatically correct output definition without any human intervention. That is the essential quality of a machine. You teach it certain things, and then it's supposed to do that consistently without our interfering with its functioning, right? So this is, as you can imagine, a very ambitious way of looking at the Astādhyāyī, because then everything has to work and fall in place, right? Um, so now the question that is related to my dissertation is, and that crops up very often when you're constructing these Sanskrit words using Pānini's grammar. Of course, Pānini is not deriving English words like definition. He is doing the same thing for Sanskrit words. If you want to, so at any step of this what we call derivation, if two rules are simultaneously applicable, or for that matter, even more than two rules, which of these rules should be applied at that step? That is a question. And colloquially, and for the purpose of this conversation, Kushal, I will call it rule conflict. Okay, irrespective of the technical inaccuracies of the term, this is widely used in secondary literature, and it's a simple term because the two rules are essentially in conflict with each other. Only one can win, only one can apply. So the one that applies wins. That's the idea of this idiom. So which of these two rules should apply? Now, I've always looked at the Astādhyāyī right from the time I began studying it as a text where Pānini tells us what is necessary. Because for me, the idea that someone would write about 3985 or so rules, about 4,000 rules, and leave certain things out, and not mention them is a bit weird. Okay. So I was always looking for instructions about how to do things from Pānini rather than from later commentators. Now, Pānini gives us only one meta rule in his grammar, 142 Vipratishedhe Param Karyam, to deal with this problem of rule conflict. Um, Before we go into that, let me just introduce very quickly the three heroes of our story, if you will. The first is Pānini, who wrote around 500 BC, the Astādhyāyī. Then around 300 BC, you have Katyana, who wrote Vartikas, which are short comments on Pānini's grammar. And then the third hero of our story is Patanjali. Well, there are many heroes because it's a long tradition, but we're going to talk about these three. So I'll mention only these for now. Patanjali wrote the Mahabhashya. Now, we actually have received Katyana's Vartikas only through Patanjali's Mahabhashya. So they don't exist as an independent document, right? So these are the three people. So 150, 500 BC first is Pānini, around 300 BC is Katyana, and 150 BC is Patanjali. So please remember that. Okay. Now Pānini taught us one rule, 142 Vipratishedhe Param Karyam. Now I'll tell you the existing traditional interpretation, okay, without getting into too many details. According to the tradition, Vipratishedhe Param Karyam, right? So Param means that rule which comes later in the serial order of the Astādhyāyī. So any rule uh, n plus x, where x is a positive integer, defeats any rule n. Or put simply, 21 defeats 20, right? So rule number 22 defeats rule number 21, and so on and so forth. And how do they define the term Vipratishedha? This is equally, if not more interesting. They say Vipratishedha means any conflict between two rules which are equally strong, or put differently, between two rules of equal strength, right? So the question that I ask is, how do you know that Vipratishedha means this? Because very simply put, if you just look at Vipratishedha from the perspective of Sanskrit grammar, it simply means mutual opposition or mutual conflict, right? Viprati and then Shedha, Siddh. So mutual, somewhat, just opposing each other. That's the idea. That's what the word means. So how does this idea of equal strength come in, right? So that's the question. But the tradition somehow thinks it's conflict between equal strength. So it introduces a completely new category to our understanding of Vipratishedha. And then you might wonder, what the hell is this equal strength? So the tradition says any pair of rules which are not of unequal strength are to be called pairs of equal strength, right? So it's not obvious. In fact, it's completely counterintuitive. So you've introduced a new category, and then you define that category as everything that is not unequal strength, right? And it only gets weird, because now the question is, what the hell is unequal strength, right? That's something we are bound to ask. So then the tradition says, if one rule, if in a rule pair, if one rule is nitya and the other anitya, then this is a pair of unequal strengths, and the nitya rule is stronger. And then it says, oh, also, if one rule is antaranga and the other is bahiranga, then antaranga is stronger, and that's also an unequal strength pair. And it says the same thing about niravakasha and savakasha, and usarga and apavada as well. Now, where did it find all this information? Well, the tradition argues that Pānini has left hints here and there, and then on the basis of that, they have developed these tools. But unfortunately, all these tools are, again, there are always qualifications, So there's this genre of literature called paribhasha literature, or meta rule literature, which tells you how the system works. And there are tens of paribhashas which further give you instructions about how to understand these tools and use them. And sometimes this is nitya, but sometimes this cannot be called nitya, and so on and so forth. The matter gets so complicated, these meta rules the funny thing is, these meta rules can also be anitya sometimes. By that they mean sometimes these meta rules are not applicable. So it's very complicated. So I'll also give you some examples of how these tools are really tricky to use. One of the tools is niravakasha and savakasha. Niravakasha essentially means that rule which is not applicable anywhere else should apply here. because otherwise Pānini would not have written it in the first place. So the idea is ideally you should go through every single derivation in the grammar to see if it's applicable elsewhere or not, right? And what if there is a conflict over there? Then you have to look at all the other derivations, which includes the current derivation, to see if it's applicable elsewhere. So this tool is actually practically useless, right? And so how does the tradition do it? It says, oh, the commentator says so, so we're supposed to assume that it's Niravakasha, right? This is one tool. Then there's another. Oh, okay. So I won't waste too much time talking about the tools. But the other thing is, if all these tools are not useful in solving that conflict, then you go to 142, because then you assume it's equal strength, and then you use 142. That's the idea. But if even that doesn't work, Kushal, then you fall back on another tool, which is Purva Vipratishidha, which is just a number of statements where Katyayana, the second hero of our story, says, uh, in this case, it's not the rule that comes later in the serial order that wins, but the rule that comes earlier in the serial order that wins. And that's it. And the tradition, without batting an eyelid, just uses these kinds of statements, as justifications for choosing a certain rule over another. So, in fact, the third hero of our story, Patanjali, goes so far as to say, on multiple instances actually, that para, the term para in Vipratishede Param Karyam means ishta, and ishta is just desirable. So essentially, just do whatever is appropriate or desirable, or whatever helps you get the correct answer. So the tradition essentially, as you can understand from what I've said so far, has added so much new stuff, has piled on so many things onto this 142. It's remarkable that the tradition does two things here, I think. If we talk about the philosophy of a discipline, it's firstly really significantly modifying the epistemology of it. So what constitutes the core knowledge of the discipline, right? Is it just the sutras of the Astādhyāyī, or can you fall back on the sutras and then Katyayana's observations, and then the Bhashya, and then the Kashika, and the Paribhasha sutras, and the Kaumudi, and so on and so forth, right? So that's a question to ask, and I think we should only fall back on Pānini's grammar and nothing else that was written after it. Everything else written after should be used for confirmatory purposes, rather than in fact, one of the things I should mention here is the tradition actually argues that the second hero, Katyayana, is more authoritative than Pānini, the first hero, and Patanjali is more authoritative than Katyayana. So the author that comes later in time is more authoritative than his predecessor, which is also counterintuitive for me, because the original guy wrote his text and possibly died before the second guy could study it. So, but why does the tradition do this? Because the tradition argues, or I think believes that, how do I put this? That all three, these are three muni. So this is one trinity of the Sanskrit grammarians. And the author who came later happened to already know what the previous one wrote and also added new things. Now, he might have added new things which are useful, but does he essentially necessarily understand the system and its functioning better? I don't think we should assume that, right? So this is again another place where I have a difference of opinion with the tradition. So I've told you about para ishta. I've told you these things. So when I reached Cambridge, I decided that, look, if I'm going to spend my time doing this rather than taking the consultancy job, which I could have after completing my bachelor's in economics, then I have to be honest to myself, right, and to the field, and really try to find a solution which Pānini must have had in mind. Because if Pānini wanted to teach us equal strength, unequal strength, nitya, anitya, antaranga, bahiranga, saukasha, anavakasha, he would have told us clearly that these are things to be used. So I thought we should be faithful to Pānini and try to find a solution which is simple, because the grammar is so elegantly written that for me, frankly, it was always very difficult to believe that all these things Pānini wanted actually for us to use. That's something that I could never digest. So with that suspicion, I started my PhD, and I said, I'm going to try to find a solution which is based only on Pānini's grammar. And so I started, and of course there was only one rule, 142, with which I could work, you know. So I started uh, performing essentially many derivations in my notebook. Okay, and I did that for the first 9 or so months of the PhD, and then I decided to take a month-long break, not having made much headway. Thereafter, begrudgingly, I went back, and when I did, I started flipping pages of the book on the top of the pile, and I noticed a pattern, you know. So when I noticed that pattern, I said, here it's always the rule that is applicable to the right hand side part of the word that wins. And I said, now look, somehow this pattern has to be read back into one of Panini's rules for us to truly treat the system as a closed one, right? And which other rule could I read it back into but 142? And so I tried to do that. So it did not take me too long to realize that param here means right hand side. So I felt confident because this pattern was repeating itself in many derivations. So I felt confident, but I was still unsure, and I was still thinking about it, you know. I spent many days doing that. Then it struck me that there's another way to confirm this. There's another obvious way to confirm this, rather, which is Panini has used the term para on many occasions in the Astādhyāyī. This is not the only occasion when he uses this term. So let's just go dig them all out and see what he means when he uses para elsewhere. So I did that, and lo and behold, well, first let me tell you, there are two ways in which Panini uses the term para in the Astādhyāyī. One is where he just mentions it as an entry in the lexicon of the language. So, for example, he says, let me give you an example from English. For example, I'm trying to teach you a rule in English where I say, when you are using uh, when you're using the verbs dance, sing, eat, jump, add this suffix, that kind of thing. So he's saying when you're using the terms para, purva, jnana, etc., just hypothetically, you add this suffix. So there it's an entry in the lexicon of the language. That's one way of using the term. But the other is the technical way of using the term, which is what we're interested in. And in my thesis in Appendix F, I've given an entire list of both non-technical and technical uses of the term in the Astādhyāyī. And I've given all the technical ones as well, as I said. In each of those instances, Pānini uses the term para to mean right hand side. And it is at that point that I felt confident and certain that my interpretation was indeed correct. And that is when I realized that I don't want to be a consultant for sure. And I really want to invest my energies, in this, spend the next couple of years seriously looking at the problem. Also, because the thing is, once you are able to unlock one very important door, if you will, many other doors open themselves. So the weeks thereafter was spent really poring over books and derivations and trying to solve related problems. And one thing led to another, and then I was able to, in the next couple of years, write all of this up and come up with a coherent solution, which took other rules into account as well. As if you remember, I've discussed in chapters 4 and 5 of my thesis. Um, so yeah, I think I'll rest my case there for now. But let me add one more thing, because I mentioned epistemology, and then I promised to stop. The other thing that Pānini does, that the tradition does, is not only is it trying to change the epistemology of the discipline, it's also changing the ontology, because ontology is what the discipline is made of, what the categories are, right? And in Vyakarana, if you're smuggling so many new categories into the system, that's going to impact also, remember, the relationships between the existing categories and the newly introduced categories. What I think happened is, the tradition might have tried to apply 142 to all instances of rule conflict and might have realized that they're getting the wrong answer very often. So then I think what the tradition did very cleverly is they tried to reduce the jurisdiction of 142 to minimize the possibility of getting the wrong answer. So they took a lot of things out of the scope of 142 and said, all these things, they developed tools for that, and they said all these things we can solve without using 142, And here, one rule is to be treated as stronger than the other. And they said, whatever we cannot solve, without with any of these tools, we will just let 142 take care of it. So the remainder goes to 142, basically. And then again, even over there, when 142 fails, they fall back on Purva Vipratishedha, which is just saying, oh, here is the opposite of what 142 teaches, and that's it. That's used as a justification to perform operations by the tradition. And as a last resort, you can simply say, para means ishta, do as you like, do what's desirable. So I think this is how the traditional understanding of 142 has come to be what it is.
So here's my first question to you. Now, when it obviously, as you have explained, the essence is about 142 and the word para. Now, why only rely on what Panini said? Is because from what I have tried to understand is you have used the occasions where Panini has used the word para, but what about the usage of the word itself in even when it comes to traditional scholarship in level 2, level 3 later on? Why not rely on them too? On, or if you test it, then do they also use it as the, as you say, right hand side?
So what I can tell you, Kushal, is I have no problem in relying on other sources if they help me understand the system better. But if they're going to make it more complicated, then I'm not going to rely on those sources. Is the idea. So it's not as though I have some personal enmity with any of these later authors, right? Uh, but to answer your question, uh, Katyana does mention both possibilities actually. He says para can mean sutra para, the rule that comes later, and also it can mean shabda para, the sound that is produced later. And we happen to write left to right, when we write Sanskrit. So that's what I mean by right hand side. But strictly speaking, this is not right hand side. I mean, if we were writing from right to left, it would have meant left hand side, you know. So when I say right hand side, I actually mean the sound that is produced later or the sound that comes later. That's the idea. So, but anyway, Katyayana does mention both possibilities in his grammar, and unfortunately, he runs with the wrong one. And I'm very curious. Actually, I've been thinking very much about why he does that. Now, I know I've mentioned in the thesis, and I will say this here. I also explain why the tradition might have misinterpreted para, because if everywhere else para means right hand side, how come the tradition did not assume that here also it means right hand side? So what happens is there is the para means that which comes after. Uh, but does it mean that? But so in Sanskrit, and its antonym is purva, which is that which comes before or that which precedes the other. Para is that which comes after or follows the other. The question is in what context? Is it in the context of the serial order of rules of the Astādhyāyī, or going from left to right when you write things down? That was the question. Now there is another rule in the Astādhyāyī, which is 821 Purvatra Siddham, Purvatra Asiddham. So looking from above, any rule that comes later, starting 821, is to be treated as suspended or not existent. That's that rule. Now there, Pānini uses Purva, which is the antonym of Para, and there, notice that the Pānini is trying to teach us the relationship between two rules based on the serial order. So I think it is from there that this confusion arose. But also notice over there, Pānini uses the suffix tra because he says purvatra. So I noticed that whenever he wants to talk about the relationship between two rules as they lie in the serial order of the text, he adds the suffix tra. So he says purvatra siddham. Similarly, he says asiddhavad atrabhat. So he says atra with respect to any rule taught here, any other rule taught in this section is to be treated as asiddhavat. That is 6 for 22. So, but essentially, it is from this purvatra that I think the confusion arose in the first place. And so, once again, to reiterate my response to what you asked, there is no problem in accepting what later scholars say. But if their interpretation runs counter to how Pānini uses the term elsewhere, and if that does not help us simplify the derivation system, if it makes us accept so many new categories and concepts which Pānini has not taught us, then the question arises: why accept it?
Okay, again, then another curious question. Now, um, I'm not giving you because see, I'm not an expert on language or grammar per se or linguistics, but I can ask you as a whole, as a thinker who's just looking at it from an outsider's perspective. Ideas tend to build on previous systems, right? Technologies or systems tend to build on previous scholarship, and then they refine it further and they make it further. So why would in this case Katyana not be a better update in that sense? Because eventually, even if you are doing this, right, you are also building on a system. So why so when you say it leads to better results, in it leads to better results in what sense?
Uh, Thank you. That's a good question. What I mean is, if you're getting too many incorrect answers at the end of the derivation using the traditional method, which is anyway so complex and frankly very difficult to navigate, then that means something is wrong. But you've raised a very good point actually, and I will use an analogy from coding, right, from computer science to to drive home my point. So yes, as traditions build over time, new good ideas might come in. But remember, we're not commenting on the Bhagavad Gita. We're commenting on a highly technical system, which we have to understand very well if we are to truly contribute to it productively. You cannot contribute to something which you don't understand fully, right? Now, and remember, Katyana has never said that I am the authority. He's a very open minded thinker who is telling us of all these multiple possibilities. Actually, if you read his Vartikas, Kushal, it's the sort of notes that you make, when you're reading something. You say, oh, this is also possible, that's also possible. Maybe that's how it is actually. But and then he corrects himself, oh no, no, but that can't be the case. It's a very intelligent, curious student of Pānini's grammar talking to himself. Okay. So no, he does not claim that he's an authority. Nowhere does he argue that he should be made into a Bhagwan, right, and worshipped. This is the doing of the later grammarians and of grammarians who come centuries later actually. uh, but now going back to the analogy from coding, imagine you wrote code for the face for the homepage of a website. Now, what are things you have to consider? You have to make sure that when someone clicks on home, for example, your front page is the director's photo with a director's welcome message or something like that. Then next to it you have our centers. Next to that, on the home page, you've got members of staff. Next to that, activities. Next to that, contact us. And then you have to make sure the drop downs work fine. You have to make sure that when you click on contact us, it takes you to your Gmail and then lets you type out an email. So you get what I'm saying, right? You're trying to build the homepage of a website. You've written code, but then you realize before the submission to your boss or to the company that in fact when you click on contact us, it does not take you as you had desired to your Gmail. And when you click on activities, instead it takes you to the home page, which it takes you to the web page which gives the address or contact us, right? So you realize there are lots of problems. So the home page is not appropriately functional. So what do you do as a coder? You go back to your code, right, and you try to find the bugs, because clearly you've or something is in an infinite loop sometimes. So those kinds of things you have to fix. And what do you do to fix those? You look for the bugs in your code, right? Now think about it this way: the tradition, instead of fixing bugs in its code, started writing new code in addition to the existing code written by Pānini. And that's where the problem arises. There is no problem in improving a system, but there is a problem when you add so much new code to a system which you have not properly understood, right? And in many respects, the tradition gives us very good, helpful information about the Astādhyāyī. It's not as though the tradition has not understood the Astādhyāyī at all. That is not a claim that I make. What I am saying is that it misunderstood a very important part of the system, as a result of which it had to add several new things onto the system, even after which the system doesn't work. You see, let's talk about it like this. Let's think about, because in the last 2 centuries, there's been a serious conversation in the West about the scientific method. what are the essential components of it, what it entails to do things scientifically. And you probably know better than I do that Karl Popper's talked about falsifiability, which is, I think, which is the tenet that is my favorite anyway. Um, so how do you falsify something? You have to draw certain quantitative or qualitative limits to your system and say, if things don't work the way these rules say, then there is a problem in the system. But for the tradition, the thing is they keep adding new meta rules every time there is a problem. So they find quick localized fixes, and then those meta rules are so the tradition says they some are anitya, which means that sometimes these meta rules are not applicable. Well, then how is it a meta rule even in the first place? Worth our attention. So the traditional method is simply not falsifiable, because every time there is a problem, you come up with a new explanation, or you simply say, in this case, actually, it's the other one that wins. So, and so if you were interpreting poetry and you came up with multiple interpretations, that would be okay, because a reader reads the text in a way that helps him or her. But this is an enterprise of theoretical linguistics. Here is an ambitious grammarian 2,500 years ago trying to construct a grammatical derivational machine. So, 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 so yes, I mean, everyone who is, in fact, I will say this: there are certain words that might not have existed during Panini's time, which did exist during Katyana's time. So in his Vartikas, he discusses possibilities of deriving them using Panini's existing rules, or he adds certain instructions, and that's all good and welcome. But that does not give anyone, and Katyana never claims that that gives him the license to misinterpret or interfere with Panini's system. As I said, this is a very curious, very intellectually sincere, honest scholar trying to figure it out. So we can't blame him for the errors. It is later scholars who seek to worship him who deserve blame, if at all. Because these are, I mean, Patanjali is also an open-minded man. Imagine when he says para means ishta, he's saying, do whatever is desirable. Perhaps he says it in a moment of frustration, because often when you're doing your research, when you're trying to figure something out, you want to give up, you know and that is Patanjali's way, or that probably is one of Patanjali's students, because remember, when Patanjali writes the Mahabhashya, it's a dialogue between multiple entities, and we don't know who says what. you know so perhaps it's one of his students saying it. So these are the early commentators, Katyana and Patanjali, are open-minded thinkers, really trying to understand this system and considering all possibilities. So I think it's really, we're doing them great injustice by converting them into Bhagwan, because whenever you call someone Bhagwan, what you're doing is you're putting them on a pedestal, and then it becomes a lot more difficult for later scholars to engage as dispassionately as a scholar ideally should with the work of those Bhagwans. That's what I think.
All right, now I want to focus on no strawmans, but two specific critiques of your work, because I think they are the only two ones that are worth discussing. बाकी तो ठीक है, सोशल मीडिया पे तो जो भी आता है, मतलब अभी कैसा हो गया कि वी आर ऑल मंदिर का घंटा, जो भी आता है बजा के चले जाता है. तो मुझे तो आदत ही है एज अ पॉडकास्टर, तो मुझे तो रोज ही आके लोग सुना के जाते हैं. बट there are two specific critiques which I did read. They are reviews, and they were critical of your work. One was published on 23rd December 2022 by Dr. Peter M. Scharf. He he did a 11 page, it was a 11 page PDF document. And another one was by Dr. Nilesh Bodas, and his was, I think, around a 20 page word doc or something. Now, one particular thing in Nilesh's critique that I actually want to start, in fact, in his closing remarks, because I think he gives a good suggestion here. This is just my view. He says that uh, he recommends that you do exhaustive testing. What he says, from what I have understood, is you've tested around 40 or 50 words, and correct me if I'm wrong and if I'm misunderstanding, but he says you should do around 100,000 word testing to be more confident, and it could be maybe done with softwares now. So can you comment on that now?
Sure. So you're right. These are two technical rebuttals, and I will respond to them. Um, I think charity should begin at home. So Nilesh should do. Nilesh should Nilesh should ideally test 1 lakh words using 100,000 words using the traditional method. But as I said, that's not a very productive enterprise, because whenever there's a problem, the traditions come up with tens, if not hundreds, of meta rules to solve that problem. You know, in a parallel system of Vyakarana, which is called Katantra, 50% of all paribhashas that were written in this genre that I mentioned, paribhasha literature, deal with rule conflict. So, I mean, as I said, any system of information has to be a closed one. So, even if you are piling onto Pānini's system, where do you draw the line? Where is the full stop? How many paribhashas are you going to be able to teach using software? Okay, let's talk about software. Are you going to be able to teach the software every single paribhasha? No, some of them are anitya. How are you going to how are you going to tell the computer that the para rule always wins, except in these cases the other rule wins? I mean, if you're going to do that, if you're going to always make exceptions to what you're teaching the computer, then what's the point of it, right? So I welcome the idea that we forget 1 lakh, we should test every single word possible. I don't disagree with that, you know. But why has it not been done for the tradition? And that's the meat of the matter. It cannot be done for the tradition. It's not a falsifiable approach, and that is precisely why I started the PhD in the first place. So that is exactly what all this is about. Now, this is not to argue that we cannot just write by hand and verify. That's also possible. But the computer, the idea is that it's free of human error. Now, this is not to suggest that it's easy to teach the whole Astādhyāyī to the computer, because there are other challenges. But I certainly think that this is the only way. I mean, this interpretation of 142 is the only one we have where we don't have to teach the computer hundreds of other things, right? So it's all good when you say that you should test 1 lakh. I say we should test millions, but the question is, have you tried to do it for the tradition? And can you do it for the tradition? Falsifiability, I keep coming back to that.
Okay, one more point Nilesh wrote in his thesis was he says, what would an early grammarian or linguist have done in order to interpret the Astādhyāyī independently with negligible access to any commentary on the text and with limited or no guidance of a teacher well versed in the Astādhyāyī? A scholar would have taken notes for himself in order to comprehend, analyze, and corroborate. Basically, he's talking about the premise that you are taking. I think he's challenging the premise in that case. So how would you respond to that?
See, the contemporary traditional approach, I have to, and the operative word here is contemporary, Kushal, because a tradition is a dynamic one. It has evolved a lot in the past. It doesn't evolve as much today, dare I add, but such has not been the state of the tradition in the past. Um, and when you read Katyana's Vartikas, this is exactly the sort of picture you get of him. So he has some information about the text, some other information he has surmised by studying it, and there are certain questions that he is unable to answer, which, believe you me, it takes a very honest and humble, self-effacing author to admit. So what is Katyana saying when he says that in certain cases the rule that comes earlier in the serial order wins? He is actually listing exceptions to what Pānini has taught us. So this is a man of great integrity, uh, but when you start worshipping something, then it becomes impossible to consider these possibilities. And I think we should keep the two realms of worship and scholarship separate to the extent possible. And so I say what I see in Pani's. Sorry, I say what I see in Katyana's Vartikas. You see, uh, what are the grounds of his objection? That is the question. Does he not see Katyana asking questions as a curious student would? I think we should be. See, this is a problem. If you assume and if you insist that everyone accept the idea that everything that these early scholars wrote is accurate, correct, perfect, then you are closing the doors to a serious intellectual inquiry into the question at hand. So let's not do that. there is another thing. I have read both rebuttals. As I said, I'm in the process of responding to them. Actually, I am putting together a document. One of the things he says is, that this has somehow hurt, Rishi should have been more careful about the words he used, because this has hurt the sentiments of uh, millions of Hindus, or something along those lines. But this is not a question of sentiments, and certainly I did not set out to hurt anyone's sentiments. But I cannot stop speaking what I find in my research because it hurts someone's sentiments. So I think that, and this is also, unfortunately, I must say, given how polarized the current climate is, be it about political issues or other issues, I think it's very irresponsible to say that you hurt this person has hurt someone's sentiments. It's a dog whistle. And you know what happens when a certain person accuses someone else of hurting the sentiments of any community, be it Hindus or any other, or Indians in any other community. So I think we should restrict ourselves to scholarship and not sentiments, and we should not, I think we should not occupy ourselves with the questions of honor, dignity, respect. uh, all I can say is I have great respect for the tradition, and yet that does not stop me from disagreeing. And this is the beauty of the tradition, actually. As I said, if you look at the evolution of the tradition, it is full of disagreements among scholars. So if anything, I'm only continuing in the line of the tradition. I'm only continuing this academic dialogue where disagreement is the norm and not the exception. Let me add one more thing. Patanjali often disagrees with Katyana, and he says, so he is also an optimizer in his own way. He says this need not be said, because Katyana often says things which Patanjali thinks are not necessary. And this is Patanjali's own version of the Occam's razor. He says this need not be said. This is not necessary. Let's minimize what we say, right? He says no vaktavyam. So this is my way of saying all these things that these scholars have said about rule conflict need not be said, because Pānini has given us a self-sufficient system. So I think it's really important to separate, as I said, spiritual. For example, I worship Hanumanji. That is my Ishta Devata. That's my personal favorite. In my family, we worship the whole Hindu pantheon, as it were. My mom likes another deity more, and so on and so forth. But the idea is, if Hanumanji had written a grammar, I would have switched to Krishna Bhagwan, right? Why? Because or I would not have switched to Krishna Bhagwan, even because for me it's okay to disagree with my deity. That's the beauty of my faith, you know. So these questions of of hurting sentiments and respect, I think we should put them on the side and really think about, let our spiritual life actually aid our scientific endeavors rather than interfere with it.
To be fair to Nilesh, Rishi, I'm just quoting. I mean, he ends the critique or the review by saying, "I'd like to thank Dr. Rishi Rajpopat for reaching out to me personally and requesting me to give the feedback on this thesis. It cannot be denied that my understanding of many concepts became much stronger after reading the thesis, for which I wholeheartedly thank Dr. Rishi Rajpopat and wish him all the best in his future endeavors." But I just have one more question. Um, this is from Sharf's review. So he says, the redefinition of the term anga is an additional fault. Now, can you explain what is he trying to say there?
So in chapter 4, Kushal, I can't unfortunately jump into the details without your knowing a certain amount of Panini, but he's referring to chapter 4, where I present my interpretation of certain rules which involve anga. The term anga is the central term there. So that's what he's talking about.
Fair enough. So basically, it is a difference between your interpretation and his interpretation, is what I have understood.
Yeah, and he tends to agree with the traditional interpretation. Yes.
Okay, now I know you have to go at 8 o'clock, so we have 5 7 minutes left. So I just wanted to, I'm gonna ask you the standard questions now, which I know a lot of people will be asking. Like, so look, the reason I only focused on on the rebuttals here is because they focused on in a very academic way. They take your hypothesis. Like I even saw the video of Nilesh, and he even there he's just focusing on the points. But there has been, like कोई भी आता है जैसे मैंने बोला, मतलब मंदिर के घंटे के जैसे बजा के चले जाता है, बट एट द एंड ऑफ द डे how does one have a discourse around this? How does one have y- you were right when you said, we have had a very robust culture of scholars disagreeing with each other. Like, people don't realize, man, people have not read Swami Dayanand Saraswati's Satyarth Prakash. Look at the latter chapters of the Satyarth Prakash, where Swami Dayanand Saraswati vehemently disagrees with Bauddha Dharma, Jaina Dharma, and Islam and Christianity, and he gives his tika. He is critical in the Satyarth Prakash. But that's the way forward now. So how do you deal with the critique? Look, I'm not technically qualified to say you're right or wrong. I read your thesis, I tried to understand it, I read the rebuttals, I tried to understand them, but I'm not going to put my neck out here and give a judgment call on what you're doing, because that's not my job, it's not my qualification. Similarly, I don't expect people to do that in my field, which is philosophy. There I will speak up. But the point is that how do we create this culture, okay, that where we do have these kinds of exchanges?
Oh, that's a tough one, Kushal. If only I had a magic potion which we could all drink and and make this possible. But I will say this: um, we have to understand. I'm going to get it a little bit into the sort of socio-political situation or the cultural situation that we are in today. We are almost 75 years uh, into in what we call independence, right, from the British Empire. Um, even during Mughal rule and even prior in previous Muslim rule periods where the Muslims ruled India, there was not there wasn't the same degree of replacement of our traditional knowledge systems as there was during the British period. So during the British period, what happens is within a very short span of time, maybe within a couple of decades, you have the English system completely replacing, both in terms of producing and disseminating knowledge, but also in terms of facilitating entry into the economy, completely replacing the traditional system. Uh, and you notice that until then you produce scholars like Nagesha, for example, in the Vyakaran tradition, who really sort of very vehemently disagree with some of their predecessors and contemporaries. Uh, and so new thought is being produced. What happens when you sideline the native traditions of our country is then the same, dare I say, quality of intellect will not be attracted by those native traditions, because a lot of our bright minds, of which we have very many, I'm proud to say as an Indian, will move towards medicine, engineering, law, for good reason. You see, because uh, you know, criticize it all you will, the fact is you do choose your educational paths as a practical person based on whether or not those will will be able to put food on your table, right? So that's, I think that's what's happened. The other thing is we tend to think about our past, our ancient past, as something to be preserved or revived or sort of tenaciously held on to. But I'm not sure if that's the right way to look at it. We must certainly take from our past what is useful. But whenever you try to rekindle something, rekindle, as it were, the exhausted lamp, or the extinguished lamp, uh, I think you should look at it as rekindling something that is dynamic. So you can't just hold on to everything that was written in the past and worship it and say, no, no, all the things that were written in the past were great and right and amazing. There were valuable things there, but we have to keep thinking about those things and challenging those things as well. So, so the idea of any civilizational revival has to be one that is dynamic and not static, because anything that is static becomes stagnant, it dies. You know, we have to look at our past as a river that keeps shaping us, the rocks, that constitute the riverbed of the river. uh, because otherwise it will become a, a, a swamp, and that's not what we want it to be. So that is my appeal, and that is what I think. uh, we live in a time when we have, when we've really, as I'm proud to say that as Indians we've really changed ourselves on many accounts in many ways, over the last 200, 300 years. So I think we should continue to march forward in that spirit, if you will, and really really try to think critically, think critically, um, without attaching honor. Let the Khapachayats worry about honor and respect and disrespect. We don't have to. So that is my message. At the end of the day, we have very much from our past about which we are all incredibly proud for very good reason. But holding on to it is going to, and saying all of that was great and correct, is only going to suffocate and kill it. Here the idea is that we bring it back to life, and revive it, and do it in the spirit of academic inquiry, and through the lens of critical rational thinking, and good scholarly debate and engagement. And not one of the things that Nilesh says in his review, which I find a bit uh, absurd, is that you can get moksha if you do vyakarana. So I will end by saying that these things should not be a part of reviews. Those may be your personal opinions, however funny I think those might be, but that we should try to really separate the two, you know, and do scholarship in a way that is scholarly. Yeah.
So when do you intend to give the rebuttal to the two reviews? An approximate
I
date.
I
I
mean
look
I
forward
I
to
would
reading
like
it.
to. Sure. So I can't put a date on it, but I will do it ASAP, basically, and I will definitely send you a copy, Kushal.
Thank you. I look forward to reading it. I can assure you one thing. Unlike others, मैं पक्का पढ़ूंगा. Rishi, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. I wish you all the best in your future endeavors, and you keep working and keep learning. And I wish you nothing but success and happiness.
Thank you so much for having me on. See you. Thank you. Bye.
All right, guys, we'll wrap it up. But before wrapping it up, just my thoughts before we close. I would highly recommend you guys. I know it's very technical, it's tedious, but if you want to have an opinion on something, right, you should read things. So what did I do? It took me time when I got the thesis of Rishi. I spent some time. I remember more than a month and a half ago, I told Rishi, I'm reading your thesis. We will discuss on the podcast, and then we couldn't find a date. Rishi was traveling. I was busy in my own thing, but I did read it. Then I found out about the two rebuttals to his thesis. I sat down, I read those. I even saw a couple of other videos. One was by Nilesh ji, where he explained the document in a video form. Then another one was Nityananda Mishra ji, and he was again using Nilesh and Peter Scharf as the basis. So the point is that these kinds of discussions should happen in a mature way. You know, giving names ad hominem, this should not happen. That if you are a true Hindu and you believe in this tradition, you should actually have a robust discussion. And I hope we continue this tradition. We need to challenge traditional concepts, or we need to go back to traditional concepts whenever we see the evidence. So the I don't know what the final word on this discussion should be, but we should all celebrate that there are people like Rishi out there who are trying to push boundaries and trying to do scholarly work. So go read his work, try to support his work. And as far as I'm concerned, you can subscribe to the Cārvāka podcast, like this video, leave a comment. And if you want to support the podcast, please become a member on YouTube or Patreon or Fanmo, or buy the podcast merch. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste, take care, bye bye.